To assess the situation, I'm joined by Dr. Liam Fox MP, like me, a former Defence Secretary, but a more recent one than I wonder, Liam, it's very nice to have you on the programme.
Thank you.
How you assess the solidarity of NATO so far. Are you content with it?
I think that we need to ensure that two things happen. One is that we, as you say, increase and speed up the amount of weaponry that we're supplying to Ukraine, and the other side is the political solidarity. One, I think, is performing better than the other at the present time. I think we've, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, have been very good at giving what Ukraine has been asking for: anti-tank weaponry, anti-aircraft guns, missiles and so on. I think the problem there is that Russia is moving on to a war footing in terms of production. And so it's not just what we're giving, it's how quickly we're giving. And it's one thing to say we will give Leopard tanks throughout the year. Ukraine needs them now so that it can get momentum on the battlefield, and that is crucial, I think, to maintaining that second part, which is the international political solidarity. And I think that we need to recognise that one of the weaknesses in the NATO position has been, frankly, a failure of deterrence in recent years. And deterrence is not just, as you know, having sufficient weaponry, but the will to use it. And we watched while Putin went into Georgia and then into Crimea. We had the humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. All of those were, in my view, a failure of political as well as military deterrence.
I worry about a certain complacency on the Allied side. There's now a kind of assumption that Russia is going to lose. This seems to me not to be inevitable. I mean, Russia can always draw on many more fighters, and we don't know yet whether China might supply armaments. We do know that Iran is doing so. We have certainly not moved to a war footing in this country, as far as I know. And by a war footing, I mean rates of production, which would ascertain that we could provide weapons to Ukraine on a continuing basis. Do you see evidence that our industry is at that level of production that would be required to sustain the Ukrainian defence?
Well, I think, first of all, the analysis that you make is entirely correct. Russia has always in its history been willing to bleed its country dry, both its people and its economy, to fulfil the policies of the various tyrants it's had. This time is no different. Russia, in its economy, is moving towards greater armament production, and they don't really care how many young men die in Putin's vainglorious campaign. The question for us is, are we able to both increase production to supply Ukraine while restocking for the United Kingdom? And that's a question that many of us have been asking at Westminster, and I think that it's something that will be asked increasingly. Do we have not just the budget, but do we have the industrial production to be able to do both things at the same time? Provide weapons to Ukraine, but not be reducing Britain's own capability.
Yes, I mean, I've been quite shocked by the reduced level of our armaments, and this has been happening over many decades, but, you know, we're down to about 148 tanks and I think 18 surface ships and so on, despite the fact that we're spending 50 billion on defence. And, of course, we also know that the numbers on the books are not necessarily the numbers that you can actually deploy, because there are issues like servicing of the vehicles, whether they're ready to go, whether they have the trained crews, and how long you can maintain all of those things. Have you been caused new anxiety by the way we've been exposed, the thinness of our defence?
Well, I think there are two elements that concern me. One is that, and I think that we do need to ensure that as an alliance we've got sufficient capability across the board. Only the United States is big enough really to have full spectrum defence capabilities. Therefore, there's got to be a pretty brutal debate amongst the rest of the, particularly European allies, as to who does what. Britain contributes our nuclear deterrence. We've got our carrier strike capability, which includes, for example, the F-35 aircraft, which are not cheap. We've got the upgrading of our nuclear submarines. We've got our big increase in our cyber capability. Can the United Kingdom really be expected to provide a lot of the land defences for continental Europe, which should surely be the job of countries like Germany and France, who are part of continental Europe? So there needs to be a wider debate, and I think that we need to focus on what is in Britain's national interest in terms of our defence, and what do we need, frankly, to be encouraging our partners to do that they're not doing sufficiently.
If I were the Russians, I'd be waiting for Western allied fatigue with the war, and I'd be looking in particular towards the United States election. Ukraine might well be an issue during that election, and there might be a change of policy if the Republicans were to occupy the White House. You know a lot about what's going on in the United States, particularly on the Conservative side. Give me some feel for whether you think the Republicans are minded to switch the policy.
So I think on both wings, on the left of the Democratic Party and on the right of the Republican Party, you've got that traditional isolationist mentality and people saying, well, why should America be spending this amount of money on a war that has nothing to do with them? And I think the answer to your question really lies in the mainstream of both parties, recognising that what happens outside America will have an effect on America's security, either in the short, medium or long terms. And I think that there's still quite a strong level of support on both sides for the recognition that what is happening at the present time isn't just a battle about Russia versus Ukraine. It's about the maintenance of international law and whether we want to live in a world where there are rules. Russia wants to move to a world where might is right and we don't stick with law. That would have a huge impact on everything we do, not least the NATO political alliance. So I think that as long as the leadership in America remains in the mainstream of both parties, then it's relatively secure that American support will continue. It's if you get to the fringes of the parties, I think that you get that terribly isolationist, America doesn't need to bother about the rest of the world, which of course has always ended up in America becoming more involved in disputes around the world.
You and I were smoking quietly to ourselves. We saw John Bolton a moment ago on GB News saying that he's determined to stop Donald Trump getting back. For instance, if Donald Trump did get back, would that move this debate to the fringe?
I don't know. I think it's interesting, of course, that the incursions into Georgia and Crimea and Ukraine didn't occur on either the watch of George Bush or Donald Trump. I mean, that may be one conspiracy theory too far. But I think it's quite clear that the majority of the Republicans are in one place on this, and I don't think it would be advantageous to any candidate to be out of line with that broad Republican opinion. And I don't see that happening yet, although it's not out of the question. And then, of course, we have the very strange primary system that the Americans have,
of course,
which can throw up some quite odd results, largely based on how many candidates actually run. So I'm sure John Bolton, like the rest, will be considering the size of the field and whether that, in fact, would favour Donald Trump before he would be willing to throw his hat into the ring.
Let us briefly do a handbrake turn and talk about Northern Ireland. It looks as though an agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom is on the way. How do you think you'll feel about that, and how do you think the DUP will feel about that?
Well, like many Brexiteers, I voted for Boris Johnson's protocol, knowing that it was, from a purist point of view, deeply flawed, that it kept Northern Ireland inside European law, at least in some areas, and also that on a practical basis it put barriers into the UK's single market because of checks going to Northern Ireland. And I voted for that on the basis that we had to leave the European Union and we didn't want to remain in the permanent purgatory of where we were at that time. My view in doing so was that we would be able to improve on that deal as time went by and as the European Union saw the benefits of that and as the sort of tension and the hurt around Brexit dissipated. If we were able to get a better deal than that one, naturally I would support that.
Yes.
And I find it difficult to believe that any of my colleagues would say, because the deal is not perfect, we'll stick with the one that we currently find unacceptable. The logic of that position rather
That's spoken of your colleagues. What about the DUP?
So I think the DUP will also be willing to see these restrictions diminished, again, in the hope that over time some of them might disappear. I think the hope that the European Union would give up entirely on European law applying to some elements in Northern Ireland is unlikely, given what the British government conceded in the protocol, but we can make progress on that, and I think that both sides will want to see the Northern Ireland Assembly up and running because that's the best guarantee to political stability and a reduction in violence in Northern Ireland. And this week we've had a warning of what that violence can look like and may just be the impetus that people need to get the political process moving.
Very interesting. Dr. Liam Fox, my friend of what, between 30 and 40 years, I suppose?
Longer than either of us probably care to remember, Michael.
Lovely to have you on GB News. Thank you very much.